They called it justice, but no one in that town could say what crime she had committed, not in words that held together, not in a way that sounded the same twice. The sun sat high above the square, dry and unforgiving, casting long pale light over the wooden platform they had built in a hurry, boards still smelling of fresh cuts and sap. Dust drifted slow in the air, catching that light like something suspended between truth and lie. Ayanna stood at the center of it all, her hands bound in front of her, her posture straight, her eyes steady in a way that unsettled the people gathered there more than any protest ever could. She did not struggle. She did not plead. She simply watched. Around her, the town pressed in, boots grinding into the dirt, murmurs rising and falling like wind through brittle grass. Some said she had been seen near the edge of Miller's ranch the night his cattle went missing. Others swore they heard voices in a language they did not understand and decided that was reason enough. A man near the front tightened his jaw and pointed without quite meeting her eyes, saying she didn't belong here, saying that was enough. No one asked for proof. They asked for agreement. And agreement came easy in a place where fear passed faster than truth. The sheriff stood off to the side, hat pulled low, thumb hooked near his belt, but never quite resting, as if even he wasn't sure what role he played in what was unfolding. He cleared his throat once, then thought better of speaking. The wooden beam above creaked softly in the heat, the rope hanging from it swaying just enough to be noticed, just enough to remind everyone why they had gathered. Still, Ayanna did not look at it. Her gaze moved slowly across the crowd, not searching, not accusing, just seeing. It made people shift where they stood. It made them look away. A child near the back tried to ask a question, but his mother pulled him close before the words could form. Silence followed, but it wasn't empty. It was thick, heavy, filled with everything no one wanted to say out loud. Somewhere beyond the edge of town, a horse approached at a steady pace, hooves measured, unhurried, as if it had all the time in the world. No one noticed at first. They were too busy watching a girl who refused to look afraid. And that, more than anything, made them uneasy, because fear would have made this easier. Fear would have made it make sense. But there was no fear in her face, only something quieter, something that didn't belong to them, something that made their version of justice feel thin, like a story told too many times without ever being true. The first sound that truly broke the stillness was not a voice, but the slow, steady rhythm of hoofbeats drawing closer, each step measured like someone who had no intention of arriving too soon or too late, just exactly when the moment required it. Ayanna heard it before most others did, her eyes shifting slightly toward the far edge of the square where the road cut through dry earth and scattered brush, though she did not turn her head, only listened. The way someone listens who has learned that sound often carries more truth than words. The crowd noticed next, one by one, conversations thinning into murmurs, then into silence again as heads turned and shoulders shifted, creating a narrow path without anyone admitting they had moved at all. The rider came into view through the haze of dust, a dark horse beneath him, tall and steady, its coat catching the sun in muted flashes as it walked forward without hesitation. The man in the saddle did not rush. He did not slow. He simply approached as if the gathering before him was something to be understood before it was judged. His hat cast a shadow over his face, but there was nothing uncertain in the way he held himself, back straight, hands loose, eyes taking in every detail without lingering too long on any one thing. Caleb Whitaker had passed through this town before, though not often, and never like this. Never with every pair of eyes turning toward him as if waiting for him to either join what was already decided or walk away and leave it untouched. He drew the reins gently, and the horse stopped just short of the outer edge of the crowd, hooves settling into the dirt with a soft crunch that seemed louder than it should have been. No one greeted him. No one explained. They simply watched, as if explanation itself might weaken what they had built together in the past hour. Caleb did not ask right away. His gaze moved first to the platform, then to the rope, then finally to Ayanna, standing there with a stillness that did not match the tension surrounding her. There was no panic in her posture, no strain in her shoulders, just a quiet readiness that did not belong to someone awaiting judgment, but to someone who had already accepted something deeper than the moment in front of her. That was what made him frown, just slightly, enough that anyone close might have noticed if they had been looking for it. He swung down from the saddle in one smooth motion, boots hitting the ground with a dull thud, dust rising around them in a thin cloud before settling again. The air smelled of sun-heated wood and dry leather, and something else beneath it, something sharper, like unease that had been sitting too long without being named. He rested one hand lightly on the saddle, not out of need, but out of habit, grounding himself before stepping forward into a situation that already felt unbalanced. A man near the front cleared his throat, stepping forward just enough to claim space, without truly claiming responsibility. "She is the one," he said, his voice carrying just far enough, though it lacked the weight it tried to hold. Caleb did not look at him immediately. Instead, he kept his eyes on Ayanna, watching the way she met his gaze without challenge and without submission, simply acknowledging his presence as if it mattered, though not in the way the crowd expected. The man spoke again, louder this time, as if volume might turn uncertainty into fact. "She brought trouble here." That was the word they had chosen. Trouble. It moved easily between them because it did not require detail. Caleb finally turned his head slightly, just enough to acknowledge the speaker without giving him the full attention he seemed to want. "What kind of trouble?" he asked, his voice even, not raised, not sharp, just present. The man hesitated, only for a moment, but it was enough to be seen. Different answers began to surface from different corners of the crowd, each one slightly out of step with the last, none of them fully aligning, like pieces of a story that had never been the same to begin with. Someone mentioned stolen livestock. Another spoke of voices in the dark. A third said nothing specific at all, only that things had not been right since she arrived. Caleb listened, but he did not nod, did not react, only let the words pass through the air between them, weighing not what was said, but how it was said, how it shifted, how it failed to settle into something solid. Then he looked back at Ayanna, and for the first time, his eyes narrowed just slightly, not in suspicion, but in recognition that whatever was happening here was not as simple as the town wanted it to be. And Ayanna, still bound, still standing beneath that quiet creak of wood above her, lowered her gaze for just a fraction of a second, not in fear, but towards something held close in her hands, something small, wrapped, almost hidden, as if it had been waiting longer than anyone else in that square for the right moment to be seen. The wind shifted slightly, carrying with it the faint creak of the wooden beam above and the dry scent of rope that had hung too long in the sun, and somehow that small change made everything feel closer, tighter, as if the space between each person in the square had narrowed without anyone taking a step. Caleb Whitaker moved forward one pace, slow enough that it did not provoke, deliberate enough that it could not be ignored, his boots pressing shallow prints into the dust that lingered behind him like quiet evidence of intent. No one reached for him. No one stopped him. They simply watched, waiting to see which side of their story he would choose to stand on. He stopped a few feet from the platform, close enough now to see the fine grain of the wood, the uneven nails hammered in haste, the kind of work done when people believed urgency mattered more than precision. His eyes lifted briefly to the rope, noting the way it swayed just enough to catch light, then dropped again to Ayanna's hands. The cloth she held was worn, edges softened by time, but it was not something carried without purpose. That much was clear. Sheriff Thomas Hale shifted where he stood, clearing his throat again, this time louder, as if reminding himself that silence had a cost he was no longer comfortable paying. "Caleb," he said, forcing the name into the open like it might steady things, "you came at a bad time." Caleb did not look at him right away. "Bad for who?" he asked, his voice quiet, not challenging, but not yielding either. The sheriff hesitated, and that hesitation spread outward, touching the crowd in small, subtle ways, shoulders tightening, eyes flicking toward one another, as if they were all waiting for someone else to carry the certainty they had claimed moments before. "She does not belong here," someone said from the left, the words sharper now, less certain in tone than in volume. "This is not her land." Another voice followed, overlapping, trying to reinforce what had already begun to fray. Things were fine before she showed up. That was enough. It had always been enough. Caleb let the words settle, did not interrupt, did not dismiss them, only listened as they repeated in different forms, each version losing a little more shape than the last, until what remained was not accusation, but discomfort dressed as conviction. He finally turned his head toward the sheriff, studying the man's face, the lines around his eyes, the way his jaw set without quite holding. "Did anyone see her do anything wrong?" Caleb asked, not raising his voice, not softening it either. The question hung there, simple and direct, the kind of question that should have been asked first, but rarely was. Silence answered him. Not the kind of silence that follows agreement, but the kind that comes when people realize they have stepped too far forward without knowing what ground they stand on. Ayanna shifted then, just slightly, enough that the movement drew his attention back to her, her fingers tightening around the cloth for a moment before easing again, as if whatever she held carried weight beyond its size. She lifted her gaze to meet his, and for the first time, there was something new there, not fear, not relief, but a quiet acknowledgement, like two people recognizing the same thing from opposite sides of a distance. Caleb exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible, and stepped closer, now within arm's reach of the platform, though he did not touch it. "What are you holding?" he asked, directing the question to her, not to the crowd, not to the sheriff, just to her. Ayanna did not answer with words. She looked down at her hands again, then back at him, and for a brief moment, the entire square seemed to hold its breath, as if even the wind had paused to listen. The cloth shifted slightly as her fingers adjusted, revealing the faint outline of something inside, small, solid, deliberate. Behind Caleb, someone muttered that it did not matter, that whatever it was could not change what had already been decided, but the words lacked force now, falling flat against the growing awareness that nothing had truly been decided at all. Caleb did not turn. He did not respond. He only waited, steady and still, giving the moment space to unfold without forcing it, because somewhere beneath the noise, beneath the dust and the assumptions and the hurried certainty, there was something else beginning to surface, something quieter, something that did not belong to the crowd, and it was in Ayanna's hands, waiting. The moment stretched, thin as a wire pulled too tight, and no one in that square seemed willing to be the one who snapped it first. Ayanna's fingers moved again, slow, careful, as if the object inside the cloth demanded respect, not urgency, and Caleb noticed the way her hands did not tremble, not even now, not even with every eye fixed on her. That alone was enough to unsettle him more than any shouted accusation could have. People who feared judgment did not move like that. People who carried something certain did. He shifted his weight slightly, boots pressing deeper into the dry ground, and lowered his voice just enough that it felt separate from the noise behind him. "Show me," he said, not as an order, not as a demand, but as a request that carried its own quiet weight. For a second, nothing happened. The crowd leaned forward without realizing it, drawn by something they did not yet understand, their earlier confidence now replaced by a kind of restless anticipation. Even Sheriff Hale stepped closer, though his hand still hovered near his belt, uncertain whether he was meant to act or simply witness. Ayanna exhaled softly, the sound barely audible, and then she began to unfold the cloth. The fabric opened in layers, each fold revealing just a little more, until finally something small and metallic caught the sunlight and held it there. It was a single bullet. Not polished, not new, but marked. The surface bore shallow etchings, deliberate. Careful work done by a steady hand, and even from where he stood, Caleb could see that it was not random. It meant something. He reached out slowly, pausing just before his fingers touched it, giving her the chance to pull away if she wished, but she did not. She let him take it. The metal was warm from her hands, heavier than it should have been for its size, as if whatever it carried was not just weight, but memory. Caleb turned it slightly between his fingers, angling it toward the light, and the markings came into focus. A name, not carved deeply, but clearly enough that it could not be mistaken once seen. He did not speak it right away. He did not need to. The silence around him began to shift again, not outward this time, but inward, drawing tight around a single point as realization moved through the crowd like a slow ripple. Someone near the front took a step back. Another man frowned, leaning forward as if distance might change what he was seeing. Sheriff Hale's posture stiffened, his eyes narrowing as he tried to read the inscription from where he stood, but he did not move closer. He did not want to. Caleb finally lifted his gaze from the bullet, letting it travel across the faces in front of him, watching for recognition, for the moment when confusion gave way to something sharper, something harder to ignore. It did not take long. A man off to the right shifted suddenly, his shoulders tightening, his jaw setting in a way that spoke louder than any denial. He did not step forward. He did not speak. But he could not hide the way his eyes flicked toward the object in Caleb's hand, and then away again, too quickly. Caleb saw it. So did others. The crowd, once unified in its certainty, began to fracture in small, quiet ways, glances exchanged, doubts forming where there had been none before. No one shouted now. No one pushed forward. They simply watched, as if the ground beneath them had changed without warning. Caleb held the bullet a moment longer, then turned it slightly so that the light caught the name again, not for himself, but for them, letting the truth sit there in plain sight without explanation. He did not accuse. He did not declare. He only looked at Ayanna once more, and she met his gaze with the same calm as before, as if this moment had always been waiting, as if everything that had led here had been leading to this single, quiet reveal. And in that silence, heavier now than anything spoken, the town began to understand that whatever justice they thought they were carrying had never belonged to them at all. No one moved to take the bullet from Caleb's hand, and that alone said more than anything spoken so far, because moments earlier they had all been certain, loud, unified, and now they stood divided by something no one wanted to name. The man on the right shifted again, a fraction of a step back, then stilled himself as if retreat might make things worse, his eyes no longer meeting anyone else's, fixed instead on the ground where the dust had begun to settle in thin, uneven lines. Caleb watched him without turning his body, without pointing, simply allowing the weight of that small piece of metal to do what words could not. Sheriff Hale finally stepped forward, slower than before, his boots dragging slightly, as if each step required a decision he was not prepared to make, his gaze flicking between Caleb, the bullet, and the man who had grown noticeably quiet. "Let me see it," the sheriff said, though the request lacked authority, more a formality than a command. Caleb held it out, not dropping it into his hand, but offering it openly, giving Hale the choice to take it or not. The sheriff hesitated for a heartbeat, then reached out, his fingers closing around the metal with a stiffness that betrayed the tension running through him. He turned it once, then again, bringing it closer to his eyes, and when he finally read the name, something in his posture changed, subtle but unmistakable, like a man realizing the ground beneath him was not as steady as he had believed. He did not say the name out loud. He did not need to. The silence thickened, pressing in from all sides, and the crowd that had once filled the square with noise now seemed unsure of where to place their voices. Ayanna remained where she was, her hands still bound, her shoulders relaxed in a way that no longer looked like resignation, but certainty, as if she had already stepped beyond whatever judgment they had tried to place on her. Caleb took a small step back, giving space not to the crowd, but to the truth that had just surfaced, letting it stand on its own without forcing it forward. The man on the right finally lifted his head, his face tight, his expression caught between denial and something deeper, something closer to recognition. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again, the words failing before they could take shape. Someone near him shifted away, just a few inches, but enough to be noticed, enough to break whatever fragile unity had held them together. That was how it began, not with accusation, not with confrontation, but with distance, small and quiet, spreading from one person to the next. Sheriff Hale lowered the bullet slowly, his hand no longer steady, his eyes moving across the crowd, as if searching for guidance that no one was willing to give. "This changes things," he said finally, though his voice sounded uncertain, as if even he was not sure how. Caleb looked at him then, not sharply, not with judgment, just with a calm that carried its own expectation. "It does not change anything," Caleb replied, his tone even, almost soft. "It shows what was already true." The words settled into the space between them, simple, unadorned, and harder to ignore than anything louder might have been. Hale exhaled, long and slow, his shoulders lowering as if something he had been holding on to was finally slipping away. He turned toward Ayanna, really looking at her now, not as a problem to be solved, but as a person who had stood in front of them all along without being seen. "Untie her," he said, though he did not move to do it himself. For a moment, no one responded. Then a young man stepped forward, hesitant, uncertain, his hands moving awkwardly as he reached for the rope at her wrists. He avoided her eyes, focusing instead on the knot, fingers fumbling before finally loosening it enough for the rope to fall away. Ayanna did not pull back. She did not rush. She simply lowered her hands, rubbing one wrist lightly as if reacquainting herself with the freedom she had never truly lost. The crowd parted without being told, a narrow path opening through the dust, not out of respect, not yet, but out of something closer to discomfort, a need to step aside from what they had nearly done. Caleb watched her for a moment, then stepped back another pace, clearing the space in front of her without saying a word. Ayanna looked at him briefly, not with gratitude, not with expectation, just with quiet acknowledgement, then turned and began to walk, her steps steady, unhurried, carrying her through the silence they had created and leaving it behind her like something that no longer belonged to her at all. The sound of her footsteps faded slowly across the wooden boards and into the open dust beyond the square, and no one followed, not because they were told not to, but because something inside them had already stepped back farther than their boots ever could. Caleb remained where he was for a moment longer, his gaze drifting from the empty space she had just crossed to the faces still gathered around him, each one carrying a different version of what had just happened, none of them spoken, all of them understood. The rope above creaked again, softer now, as if even it had lost its purpose. Sheriff Hale stood with the bullet still in his hand, turning it once more between his fingers, though he no longer seemed to be reading the name, only feeling its presence, its weight, as if trying to measure something that could not be held that way. "What do we do now?" Hale asked quietly, not directing the question at anyone in particular, but it settled closest to Caleb all the same. Caleb did not answer right away. He stepped toward his horse, resting a hand along the worn leather of the saddle, eyes lifting briefly to the horizon where the land stretched wide and indifferent, the kind of land that did not keep track of men's mistakes, only the trails they chose afterward. "You already did it," Caleb said finally, his voice low, steady. "You decided before you knew." Hale exhaled, his shoulders dipping slightly, the words landing heavier than any accusation could have, because they did not accuse, they simply reflected. Around them, the crowd had begun to thin, not all at once, but in small, quiet departures, people turning away in ones and twos, conversations kept low, unfinished, as if speaking too clearly might force them to admit something they were not ready to face. The man who had stood off to the right earlier was gone now, no one noticing when he had slipped away, only the absence remaining, noticeable in the same way a missing plank in a fence draws the eye after it is already gone. Hale looked down at the bullet again, then closed his hand around it, not tight, just enough to keep it from falling, as if letting it drop would mean letting the moment escape without consequence. He walked a few steps toward the edge of the platform, then stopped, turning back toward Caleb with a question that carried less authority than before, but more honesty. "You think she will come back?" he asked. Caleb shook his head slightly, not dismissive, just certain in a way that did not need explanation. "Not for this," he said. The answer seemed to settle something in Hale, though whether it brought relief or regret was harder to tell. He nodded once, then stepped away, moving toward the office at the far end of the square, his pace slower than usual, as if each step required more thought than it had before. Caleb watched him go for a moment, then turned his attention back to the open path where Ayanna had disappeared beyond the last building. The dust had already begun to settle there, the marks of her passing fading into the same ground that had held everyone else's. He swung into the saddle with a practiced ease, the motion smooth, familiar, his hand adjusting the reins without looking. For a brief second, he considered riding in the direction she had gone, not out of obligation, not out of curiosity, but because something in her silence had left an impression that did not easily fade. But he did not. Some things were not meant to be followed. Some things were meant to be understood from a distance, then carried quietly. He turned the horse instead, guiding it toward the road that would take him away from the square, away from the lingering tension that still hung in the air like heat. As he passed the edge of town, he did not look back. Behind him, the square returned slowly to itself, though not quite the same. The board still there, the rope still hanging, but something unseen shifted, something that would not be spoken of directly, but would remain in the way people paused a little longer before judging, in the way questions might come before decisions, if only by a moment. And somewhere beyond the reach of their voices, Ayanna walked on without hurry, without looking over her shoulder, carrying nothing now in her hands, because what needed to be seen had already been shown, and what needed to be understood would take longer than any of them yet realized. The road stretched out ahead of Caleb in a long, pale ribbon, cutting through low scrub and open land that carried the quiet weight of distance, and for a while he rode without thinking, letting the steady rhythm of the horse beneath him settle what had not yet found shape in his mind. The town behind him grew smaller without effort, its edges softening in the heat until it became just another mark on the land, no different from the others he had passed through and left behind. But something of it remained, not in the buildings or the people, but in the silence that followed him, the kind that did not fade with miles. He slowed the horse slightly as the ground dipped toward a shallow creek bed, dry this time of year, the cracked earth holding the memory of water that had not come in months. That was when he saw her again, not far ahead, walking along the edge of the wash, her steps steady, her pace unhurried, as if she had always known where she was going and had no reason to arrive any sooner. Caleb did not call out. He did not urge the horse forward. He simply guided it closer until the distance between them was no longer something that required a voice to bridge. Ayanna did not turn immediately, but there was a shift in her posture, slight, almost unnoticeable, the kind that came from awareness rather than surprise. She had heard him long before he reached her. The wind moved gently through the dry grass, carrying the faint scent of dust and sun-warmed earth, and for a moment they existed in that shared quiet, neither one breaking it, neither one needing to. Caleb brought the horse to a stop a few feet behind her, the animal lowering its head slightly, patient, as if it understood that this was not a moment to interrupt. "You knew that would happen," he said finally, his voice calm, not accusing, not questioning, simply stating what had begun to feel obvious. Ayanna turned then, slowly, her eyes meeting his without hesitation, and there was something in them that had not been there in the square, something lighter, though no less steady. "I knew they needed to see it," she said, her voice even, carrying the quiet weight of someone who had already walked through what others were just beginning to understand. Caleb studied her for a moment, taking in the way she stood now, no rope at her wrists, no crowd around her, just open land and sky, and yet she seemed unchanged in the ways that mattered. "You could have shown them sooner," he said. Ayanna shook her head once, a small motion, but firm. "They would not have looked," she replied. "Not then." Caleb let that settle, feeling the truth in it without needing to argue. The horse shifted slightly beneath him, hooves pressing into the dry edge of the creek bed, a soft sound that faded as quickly as it came. "Why carry it at all?" he asked after a moment, his gaze drifting briefly toward her hands, now empty, the cloth gone, the bullet no longer visible. Ayanna followed his glance, then looked back up at him. "Because it was not mine to keep," she said. "It belonged to the truth, and the truth does not stay hidden forever." The words were simple, but they held something deeper, something that did not ask to be explained further. Caleb nodded once, more to himself than to her, as if acknowledging a lesson he had not known he needed. He adjusted the reins slightly, though he made no move to leave. "You did not come back for thanks," he said. Ayanna's expression did not change, but there was a hint of something in her eyes, not quite a smile, not quite anything that needed to be named. "No," she said. "Then why stay?" he asked, not pressing, just following the thread of what was there. She turned her gaze toward the horizon, where the land stretched wide and open, the kind of place where paths crossed without promise of meeting again. "Because sometimes," she said quietly, "people need a little more time to understand what they have already seen." The wind moved again, brushing past them, carrying her words away into the open space, where they seemed to settle just beyond reach. Caleb watched her for a moment longer, then nodded once more, this time with a quiet finality. He did not offer help. He did not ask where she was going. Some questions did not need answers. He turned the horse slightly, preparing to ride on, but before he did, he glanced back at her one last time. Ayanna had already begun to walk again, her steps steady, her path her own, leaving behind nothing but faint impressions in the dust that would soon disappear. And Caleb, sitting there for just a second longer than necessary, realized that what had happened in that town was not something that had been resolved. Not fully. Not yet. But something that had begun. Something that would take root in ways none of them could see. Carried not by words, but by the quiet understanding that sometimes the hardest thing to face is not what is hidden, but what has been in front of you all along. By the time the sun began its slow descent toward the far ridge, the town no longer looked the same. Though nothing visible had truly changed, the same buildings stood, the same wooden signs creaked in the dry wind, the same rope still hung from the beam in the square, but something quieter had shifted beneath it all, something that could not be seen unless you knew where to look. Sheriff Hale remained on the porch of his office longer than usual, the bullet resting on the desk behind him where he had placed it without ceremony. Yet he had not closed the door, as if part of him understood that shutting it away would not undo what it represented. People passed by slower now, their steps less certain, their conversations lower, glances lingering just a second too long before looking away, as if each person carried a question they were not ready to speak aloud. A man who had once stood at the front of the crowd avoided the square entirely, choosing the longer path behind the general store, though no one called him out for it. No one needed to, the absence said enough. Near the well, two women spoke in hushed tones, not about what had happened, but around it, circling the truth without naming it, because naming it would mean admitting how close they had come to something they could not take back. The air held that weight, not heavy like before, but persistent, like dust that refused to fully settle. Hale finally stepped inside, closing the door halfway, not fully, leaving a narrow line of light cutting across the floor toward the desk where the bullet lay. He looked at it again, not with confusion now, but with something closer to responsibility, as if the small piece of metal had shifted from evidence to reminder. He reached out, not to pick it up, but to turn it slightly so that the name faced upward, visible, undeniable, then stepped back, letting it remain there, not hidden, not forgotten. Outside, the square remained quiet, the wooden platform still in place, but no one approached it. No one spoke of using it again, not because of any law, but because something inside them had changed the meaning of it. The wind moved through the empty space, carrying with it the faint echo of voices that had once filled it, now replaced by something more uncertain, more thoughtful. Beyond the edge of town, the land stretched wide, and along that stretch, two separate paths continued, one marked by the steady tracks of a horse, the other by the lighter imprint of footsteps that would soon disappear. Caleb rode without looking back, not because he did not care, but because he understood that what needed to stay behind was not meant to follow him. The rhythm of the horse beneath him returned to something familiar, grounding, the kind of movement that allowed thoughts to settle into something clearer. He did not replay the scene in his mind. He did not measure it or weigh it. Some things were not meant to be revisited, only carried forward in quieter ways. Ayanna, miles away now, moved along the edge of a distant ridge, her figure small against the open sky, her path unmarked by anything but her own choosing. She did not slow. She did not pause. The wind carried across the land, brushing past her as it had in the town, but here it felt different, less confined, less burdened, as if the land itself had no need to judge, only to witness. Somewhere between those two paths, between what had happened and what would come next, the truth remained, not in the bullet, not in the rope, not in the words that had been spoken or left unsaid, but in the quiet space that followed, where people were left alone with what they had almost done. And in that space, something rare began to take hold, not loud, not immediate, but steady, like a seed pressed into dry ground, waiting not for permission, but for time, because out here, change did not arrive with force. It came slowly, carried on small moments, on questions asked a little sooner, on judgments made a little later, until one day, without anyone noticing exactly when it happened, the silence itself began to mean something different. Morning came without ceremony, the kind of pale light that spread slowly across the land as if it had nowhere else to be, touching the rooftops of the town one by one, settling over the square where the wooden platform still stood, unchanged in form but not in meaning. The rope hung where it had been left, but no one looked at it the same way anymore, and that difference, though invisible, carried more weight than anything that could be seen. Sheriff Hale stepped out onto the porch again, hat in hand this time, his eyes drifting toward the center of the square before lowering to the ground, as if the answers he had been searching for might be written there instead. He did not call anyone together. He did not make a speech. Instead, he walked slowly toward the platform, each step deliberate, each movement quiet enough that only a few early risers noticed and paused from a distance. He reached up, not with urgency, not with anger, but with a steady resolve, and lifted the rope from the beam. The wood creaked softly as the weight shifted, then fell still. Hale coiled the rope in his hands, the fibers rough against his skin, and for a moment he simply stood there, holding it, as if acknowledging what it had almost been used for. Then he turned and carried it away, not to hide it, not to destroy it, but to place it somewhere it could not be mistaken for justice again. No one applauded. No one spoke. But a few people who had gathered at the edges of the square watched in silence, their expressions unreadable, their thoughts their own. One of them, a boy no older than 12, looked from the empty beam to the sheriff and then to his father standing beside him, as if trying to understand something that had no simple explanation. His father did not speak. He only rested a hand on the boy's shoulder, not guiding, not correcting, just there. Across town, the door to the sheriff's office remained slightly open, and on the desk inside, the bullet still lay where it had been left, the name facing upward, catching the morning light in a way that made it impossible to ignore. No one had moved it. No one had tried. It remained not as evidence now, but as something quieter, something that did not accuse, did not demand, but simply existed, asking nothing more than to be remembered. Beyond the last building, the land stretched out again, unchanged, open, indifferent to what had taken place within the town's boundaries, yet somehow holding it all the same. Caleb rode along a ridge miles away, the sun at his back now, casting a long shadow ahead of him that moved with each step of the horse, stretching and shortening across the uneven ground. He did not think of himself as having done anything remarkable. He had asked a question. He had waited for an answer. That was all. But even that felt different now, as if the space between action and consequence had shifted in ways he could not fully name. He reached a point where the trail split, one path leading down toward a distant valley, the other continuing along higher ground, and he slowed, letting the horse choose its footing while he looked out across the land. Somewhere out there, beyond what he could see, Ayanna walked her own path, already farther than he would ever measure, carrying nothing with her but what she had always had, something steady, something that did not depend on the judgment of others to exist. He did not try to follow. He did not need to. Their paths had crossed where they were meant to, and that was enough. The wind moved again, light and steady, brushing past him, carrying with it the quiet sense that what had happened would not end where it had begun, that it would linger in small ways, in questions asked before decisions, in moments of pause where there had once been none. Back in the town, the square slowly filled with the ordinary rhythms of the day, footsteps, low voices, the creak of doors opening and closing, but beneath it all, something remained, something that could not be returned to what it had been before. Not because of one man, not because of one woman, but because for a brief moment, they had all been forced to see what they had almost done, and that kind of seeing does not fade easily. And out here, where the land remembers everything in its own quiet way, justice did not arrive with noise or force or triumph. It arrived in silence, in the space left behind when a man chose not to look away, and when a woman chose to let the truth speak without a single word.